January 17th, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The sky above the coral reef burned orange with the dying light of the tropical sun. Beneath it, the water shimmered, deceptively calm, unnaturally quiet. On the deck of the USS Maryland, a young ensign from Nebraska stood watching the island through binoculars, his hands trembling slightly against the cold steel. The island looked peaceful from this distance. A crescent of white sand, a tangle of palm trees, and somewhere behind that green curtain, nearly 8,000 Japanese soldiers who did not yet know they were already ghosts. The orders had come down from Admiral Raymond Spruance himself, filtered through the chain of command with the clinical precision that characterized American naval doctrine. The bombardment, scheduled to begin at dawn, would not be the usual affair, while this time there would be witnesses. This time the Americans would let some of them live, not out of mercy, not out of compassion, but because dead men tell no tales, and the United States Navy needed storytellers. The ensign lowered his binoculars. In his pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft, was a letter from his brother, a Marine corporal who had been at Tarawa 2 months prior. The letter described things the censors had missed: the smell of low tide mixed with burnt flesh, the way coral sand turned black with blood, the screams that lasted through the night. Tarawa had cost the Americans over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours. The public had been horrified. Congressmen demanded explanations. Mothers demanded answers. Yes, and the military command realized something fundamental. They had been fighting the war wrong. Not tactically, not strategically, but psychologically. 18 months earlier, American war planners had operated under assumptions inherited from the previous war, the war of trenches and attrition, where victory was measured in yards gained and casualty ratios calculated on chalkboards in Washington. The Japanese, they believed, would fight hard but rationally. When faced with overwhelming firepower, any reasonable military force would recognize futility and seek terms. This was the calculus of Western warfare, built on the foundations of European military tradition dating back to the Treaty of Westphalia. But Guadalcanal had shattered those assumptions like porcelain under a hammer. On that malarial island, American forces encountered something their training manuals had not prepared them for: an enemy for whom surrender was not merely dishonorable, but spiritually annihilating. Japanese soldiers fought from caves until the ammunition ran out, then fixed bayonets. When the bayonets broke, they used entrenching tools. When those were lost, they used their hands, and when capture seemed inevitable, they detonated grenades against their own chests or threw themselves from cliffs onto the rocks below. American commanders returned from the Pacific Theater with haunted eyes and troubling reports. Colonel Merritt Edson of the Marine Raiders wrote in a classified memo, "We are not fighting an army, we are fighting a religion." The memo circulated through the War Department, eventually landing on the desk of General George Marshall, who understood immediately that the implications extended far beyond any single island or campaign. If the Japanese would not surrender, if every island, every atoll, every conquered meter of coral had to be paid for in blood, then the mathematics of the Pacific War became unsustainable. Intelligence estimates suggested that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost upward of 1 million American casualties, 1 million mothers' sons, 1 million fathers who would never return, 1 million names carved into stone in towns across Iowa and Alabama and Oregon. This was unacceptable, not just militarily, but politically. Democracies, unlike totalitarian regimes, cannot spend their children's lives with impunity. Every casualty report was a crack in the foundation of public support. Every telegram beginning with "We regret to inform you" was a seed of doubt planted in the soil of American resolve. So the planners began to think differently. If the Japanese could not be persuaded to surrender through conventional military pressure, perhaps they could be persuaded through psychological warfare. Not propaganda leaflets or radio broadcasts, the Japanese command had proven adept at shielding their soldiers from such transparent attempts at manipulation, but something far more insidious. They would be shown. They would be given proof, irrefutable, undeniable proof, that resistance was not merely futile but suicidal, that American industrial might was not propaganda but reality, that the men they faced were not the effete, jazz-corrupted weaklings described in Tokyo's broadcasts, but warriors backed by a machine of war so vast, it is so overwhelming that even the samurai spirit would break against it like waves against a seawall. And the method would be simple: controlled demonstration. Let some live. Let them see. Let them return to their commanders, their comrades, their homeland with stories that would spread like contagion through the ranks. Let them become the instruments of their own demoralization. The Japanese soldiers garrisoned on Kwajalein had been told they were the vanguard of the Empire's defensive perimeter. They had been promised reinforcements, air support, naval artillery. They performed their calisthenics each morning with disciplined precision, maintained their weapons with ritualistic care, and wrote letters home describing their readiness to die for the emperor. Many were veterans of China. Yet where Japanese forces had achieved victory after victory against an enemy they viewed as technologically and spiritually inferior, they had learned to equate Japanese determination with Japanese invincibility. They expected the Americans to attack as they had attacked before, with preliminary bombardment, followed by landing craft, followed by brutal close-quarters combat in which Japanese night infiltration tactics and superior hand-to-hand training would offset American advantages in firepower. They expected to die. Most of them understood this with clear-eyed certainty, but they expected to die gloriously, taking 5 or 10 Americans with them, becoming examples for their younger brothers and sons. What they did not expect was what began at 06:15 hours on January 31st. As the bombardment that struck Kwajalein was unlike anything previously witnessed in the Pacific Theater, the Americans had assembled the largest concentration of naval firepower ever directed at a single target. 7 battleships, including 4 of the resurrected Pearl Harbor survivors, 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 12 escort carriers providing air support. For 3 days and nights, they poured steel and high explosives onto an island measuring less than 3 square miles. But this was not the indiscriminate saturation bombardment that had characterized earlier campaigns. American fire control had evolved. Navy spotters, working with newly trained forward observers embedded with Marine reconnaissance teams, directed fire with surgical precision. And they had maps, detailed maps created from submarine reconnaissance and aerial photography, showing not just the location of every defensive position, but the thickness of their concrete walls, the depth of their bunkers, the angles of their fields of fire. The battleships fired first, their 16-inch guns hurling shells weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. These were not aimed at the beach. Beaches could be rebuilt, but at the interior strongpoints, the command bunkers, the ammunition depots. Each shell arrived with the force of a small earthquake, punching through reinforced concrete as though it were cardboard, sending shockwaves that ruptured internal organs and shattered eardrums of anyone within 100 meters. Then came the cruisers, walking their fire across the island in methodical patterns, destroying communication trenches, collapsing tunnel networks, setting fire to supply dumps. Then the destroyers, closer to shore, targeting the machine gun nests and mortar positions with flat trajectory fire that struck horizontally rather than from above, catching defenders in their supposedly protected positions. And between the naval bombardment, the aircraft came. Wave after wave of dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers, repurposed for ground attack, each carrying a mix of high explosives and napalm, a new weapon that the Japanese had encountered only in fragmentary reports from Burma, where British forces had used it experimentally. The napalm clung to everything it touched, burning through dugout roofs, flowing into ventilation shafts, consuming the oxygen in underground chambers and leaving men asphyxiated in their shelters. For 72 hours, the island burned. Japanese defenders huddled in the deepest bunkers, hands pressed over their ears, eyes squeezed shut against the dust that filled every space. Some went mad from the concussion, running out into the open where they were torn apart by shrapnel. Others sat in darkness, reciting prayers to ancestors they would join shortly, trying to maintain the dignity expected of them in these final hours. But some, a few dozen, scattered in positions that through luck or geography had been spared the worst of the bombardment, survived with their sanity and their vision intact. And these men saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their brief lives. They saw the shells, not the explosions, not the aftermath, but the shells themselves in flight. In daylight, when conditions were right, yet you could track them, dark streaks against the blue sky, moving with impossible velocity, arriving with sounds that seemed to crack the fabric of reality itself. And they kept coming, hour after hour, day after day, with mechanical consistency that suggested not human effort, but some kind of industrial process. As though the Americans had built a factory whose sole product was destruction and whose supply chain was infinite. One Japanese lieutenant, found after the battle in a collapsed observation post with both legs shattered, described it in his final diary entry. "The shells fall like rain in the monsoon season, but rain eventually stops. This does not stop. I have counted over 3,000 impacts in my sector alone. Where do they come from? How many ships? How many factories? How many workers? We were told America was weak. Jim divided, poisoned by luxury. But this is not the work of a weak nation. This is the fist of a titan." The American planners had calculated the bombardment with deliberate precision. They had studied the reports from Tarawa, where inadequate preliminary bombardment had left Japanese defenses largely intact, resulting in the horrendous casualty rates that had shocked the nation. They had learned, but they had learned selectively. The 3-day bombardment was more than sufficient to neutralize Kwajalein's defenses. After the first day, Japanese artillery had been effectively silenced. After the second day, organized resistance was impossible. A rational military force would have invaded on the third day. But the Americans continued bombing for a fourth day, and then a fifth. This was the designed excess. And this was the margin of overkill inserted not for tactical necessity, but for psychological impact. The Americans needed survivors not just to retreat, but to witness something beyond the scale of normal military operations. They needed men who would tell their comrades, "You cannot imagine, I cannot describe it. We had 8,000 men and they erased us from existence as casually as you might sweep dust from a floor." When the Marines finally landed on February 1st, they encountered resistance that was simultaneously fierce and fragmentary. Individual Japanese soldiers, emerging from the wreckage of bunkers, fought with the expected fanaticism, but there was no coordinated defense, no fallback positions, no tactical coherence. The island's command structure had been decapitated, its communication network obliterated, and its supply system destroyed. The Marines advanced across an island that barely qualified as land anymore. The palm trees, those postcard-perfect symbols of tropical paradise, had been reduced to splintered stumps. The sand, once white, was now gray with ash and dark with blood and scorched earth. The air smelled of cordite and cooked flesh, and the sweet sour stench of ruptured sewage systems. One Marine from Chicago, whose pre-war job had been as a stockyard worker, later said the smell reminded him of the slaughterhouse at the end of a long summer day. But the organized resistance that commanders had feared, the banzai charges, the infiltration tactics, the hand-to-hand fighting that had made previous campaigns so costly, never materialized. Yet the Japanese defenders had been psychologically shattered before the first American boot touched sand. They fought because they could not surrender, but they fought without hope, without coordination, without the spiritual certainty that had powered their earlier victories. The island fell in 3 days. American casualties, fewer than 200 killed. Japanese casualties, nearly 8,000, with only a handful of survivors. Men too wounded to commit suicide. Men knocked unconscious and captured before they could resist. Men whose spirits had broken completely under the bombardment and who had hidden in rubble until the fighting ended. These survivors were not treated with the casual cruelty that had characterized earlier POW operations. Instead, they were processed with bureaucratic efficiency, given medical treatment, fed sea rations and coffee, and most importantly, allowed to sea. They were walked past American supply dumps where crates of ammunition were stacked to the height of a 2-story building. They were shown the fleet offshore, dozens of ships, more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant marine, sitting at anchor with careless confidence. They were given cigarettes, American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes and Camels, tobacco so rich it seemed obscene compared to the ersatz mixture of sawdust and bark that Japanese soldiers smoked. And then they were shipped to Oahu, where they were held in compounds that, while certainly prisons, bore no resemblance to the hell camps that Japanese forces had created for Allied POWs. They were fed 3 meals a day, given medical care, allowed to wash, provided with clean clothes. Not out of humanitarian principle, though some American guards certainly felt sympathy, but because every calorie, every bandage, every bar of soap was a form of propaganda more effective than any leaflet. The American plan was working, but Kwajalein was only the proof of concept. The real test would come with the second wave. 6 weeks after Kwajalein fell, American forces turned their attention to Eniwatoke Atoll, 326 miles to the northwest. Japanese command, analyzing the disaster at Kwajalein, issued new directives. Defenses were deepened, positions hardened, troops instructed in new tactics designed to counter American firepower advantages. The garrison was told in explicit terms, "The enemy will attempt to demoralize you with bombardment. You must endure. Yet you must show them that Japanese spirit cannot be broken by mere explosives." But something had changed. The survivors of Kwajalein, the men who had been captured and then transferred to Japanese-controlled islands in prisoner exchanges negotiated through neutral Switzerland, had brought back their stories. And despite military censorship, despite threats of court-martial for spreading defeatist rumors, the stories spread. They spread through mess halls, whispered between sentries during night watch, written in coded language in letters sent home, stories about the number of ships, stories about the duration of bombardment, stories about American supply operations where fresh fruit was distributed to troops as casually as Japanese forces distributed rice, stories about the sheer, overwhelming, yet impossible scale of American industrial capacity. One story in particular became totemic. A Kwajalein survivor had described watching American supply operations during his captivity. A landing craft had capsized while unloading, dumping several pallets of supplies into the surf. The American beachmaster had barely glanced at it, simply radioing for replacement supplies, which arrived within 2 hours. The lost material, which included enough ammunition to supply a Japanese battalion for a month, was left in the shallow water, considered not worth the effort of recovery. "They threw away more than we had," the survivor said, "and they did not even notice." This story, more than any tactical briefing or strategic analysis, captured the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. Japan was fighting with everything it had. America was fighting with what it could spare. The Japanese military command understood the danger. They issued counter-propaganda, attempting to frame the stories as cowardice, as weakness, as spiritual corruption. But the stories had the undeniable ring of truth, and they came not from American sources, but from Japanese soldiers, men who had proven their courage, who bore the wounds to confirm their testimony. By the time American forces reached Eniwetok, the psychological groundwork had been laid. The defenders fought, of course they fought, but there was a hollowness to it, a sense of going through motions predetermined by fate. Diary entries recovered after the battle revealed a shift in tone. Where earlier writings had expressed determination and spiritual readiness, these entries were filled with resignation. "Aye, we will do our duty," one corporal wrote, "but duty cannot stop what is coming. I have heard what they did to Kwajalein. 3 days of bombardment. Perhaps we will have 4. He was wrong. Eniwetok received 6 days of preliminary bombardment. Not because it was necessary, again the defenses were neutralized within 3 days, but because American command had refined their doctrine. Each successive operation would receive more bombardment than the previous. Each would be documented more thoroughly. Each would be presented to the next garrison as evidence that resistance was not merely futile, but increasingly suicidal. At the psychological warfare officers, a newly created specialty within the military intelligence apparatus, were developing what they called the escalation protocol. It was based on a simple principle. If you want to break an enemy's will, you don't just defeat them. You defeat them so thoroughly that the anticipation of the next defeat becomes more terrifying than the defeat itself. The Japanese soldiers expected death. That was not new. The samurai tradition celebrated death in service to a greater cause. The Bushido Code provided elaborate frameworks for understanding honorable death. What they had not expected, what their cultural conditioning had not prepared them for, was irrelevance. American forces were developing tactics that bypassed strong Japanese positions entirely. The island-hopping strategy, refined through 1944, simply left heavily defended islands to wither on the vine, isolated and ignored, while American forces seized logistics hubs and airfields elsewhere. Japanese garrisons on these bypassed islands, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, were rendered strategically meaningless without firing a shot. They sat on their islands, performing their daily drills, maintaining their weapons, waiting for an attack that would never come, slowly starving as supply lines were cut and the war moved past them like a tide flowing around a rock. This was more psychologically devastating than any bombardment. Death in battle was comprehensible. Death from neglect, from strategic indifference, from being deemed not worth the ammunition to destroy, this was incomprehensible. It violated the fundamental narrative that Japanese soldiers had been raised on, that their sacrifice mattered, that their resistance had meaning, that their deaths would serve the empire. American intelligence intercepts, the code-breaking operation at Pearl Harbor, was reading Japanese military communications with near-perfect reliability by mid-1944, revealed the psychological impact. Morale reports from bypassed garrisons showed epidemic levels of depression, conflict between officers and enlisted men, and a breakdown in military discipline that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Some garrisons resorted to launching doomed attacks against impossible targets simply to achieve death in battle, rather than slow disintegration through disease and starvation. The Americans had discovered something more effective than killing the enemy, making the enemy feel that their willingness to die didn't matter. Throughout this evolution, one symbol recurred in Japanese prisoners' accounts with striking frequency: food, not weapons, though American firepower superiority was obvious; not ships, though the naval disparity was overwhelming; but food. The sheer abundance, variety, and casual distribution of American military rations became the physical manifestation of an ideological difference that Japanese soldiers struggled to articulate. Japanese military rations in the Pacific Theater were notoriously inadequate. By 1944, with supply lines under constant submarine attack, and logistics prioritized for aviation fuel and ammunition, many garrisons were on partial starvation rations. Rice supplemented with whatever could be foraged locally, a diet that left men perpetually hungry, vulnerable to disease, and increasingly desperate. Officers received marginally better rations, but even they were eating perhaps 1,500 calories per day in combat zones. American troops, by contrast, were receiving approximately 4,000 calories per day. The C ration, the standard field ration, included canned meat, crackers, candy, cigarettes, and instant coffee. The K ration added cheese, fruit bars, and bouillon powder, and for troops in rear areas or on ships, hot meals were served: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, and dessert. Real dessert: cake or pie or ice cream. Ice cream. This detail, more than any other, seemed to break Japanese comprehension. Multiple prisoner accounts mention American ships equipped with ice cream-making facilities. The USS Lexington, one of the new Essex-class carriers, had equipment capable of producing over 1,000 gallons per day. Ice cream, in the tropics, distributed to sailors not as a rare treat, but as a routine part of life aboard ship. To Japanese soldiers who were sucking moisture from tree roots and eating bark to stave off starvation, this was not merely abundance, it was a kind of obscenity. It suggested an economy of such impossible surplus that, even in the middle of a global war, fighting thousands of miles from home, American forces could afford to dedicate ship space, fuel, and labor to frozen desserts. One prisoner interview transcript, preserved in the National Archives, captures this cognitive dissonance perfectly. The interviewer, asking routine questions about Japanese defensive positions, had offered the prisoner a chocolate bar. The prisoner, a sergeant who had fought in China and Guadalcanal, took the chocolate and then began to weep. When asked why, he said, "You feed this to your soldiers. Chocolate. Like it is nothing. We cannot feed our soldiers rice, and you give them chocolate." The interrogator noted that the sergeant provided detailed intelligence about Japanese positions after this exchange, but his cooperation seemed motivated not by coercion, but by a kind of numbed resignation, as though the chocolate bar had communicated something that no amount of military briefing could convey about the ultimate outcome of the war. By late 1944, the American psychological warfare doctrine had matured into a sophisticated system. Intelligence officers had developed target categories, garrisons that would be completely destroyed to demonstrate American firepower, garrisons that would be isolated to demonstrate American reach, and garrisons that would be allowed limited survival specifically to create witnesses. This last category was the most cynical and the most effective. American forces would identify defensive positions that were likely to have survivors, typically underground bunkers with sufficient depth to withstand bombardment, and would deliberately moderate fire in those specific sectors. Not enough to provide tactical advantage to the enemy, but enough to ensure that some defenders would survive to see the aftermath. These survivors would emerge from their shelters into a landscape of absolute devastation. And they would see the scattered remains of comrades, not neat bodies, but fragments, pieces, the anonymous meat that high explosives make of human beings. They would see the wreckage of weapons that had been considered state-of-the-art, coastal guns twisted into scrap metal, tanks flipped over like toys, bunkers collapsed into rubble. And they would see American forces moving through this wreckage with casual confidence, smoking cigarettes, laughing, complaining about minor discomforts, treating the apocalyptic battlefield as though it were a routine work environment. This contrast between the Japanese experience of bombardment as existential horror and the American treatment of it as bureaucratic procedure was the message. It communicated that this was not a peer conflict between comparable powers, but something closer to an industrial accident, with Japanese forces cast in the role of bystanders caught in machinery they had no capacity to understand or resist. The survivors, once captured, were processed through camps where the psychological programming continued. They were shown American newspapers featuring advertisements for civilian goods, stories about labor disputes and electoral politics, comics and sports scores. The message being, America was fighting this war with such a small fraction of its attention and resources that civilian life continued essentially uninterrupted. No rationing of ice cream, no conscription of teenage girls into factory work, no cities burned by strategic bombing, just democracy, proceeding with its ordinary business while its military casually dismantled the Empire of Japan. Some prisoners broke completely, collaborating with American psychological warfare operations, recording radio broadcasts urging surrender. But the Americans had learned that these were less effective than the silent testimony of returned prisoners who said nothing at all, who simply carried in their eyes and their demeanor the knowledge of what they had seen. The transformation in Japanese military psychology was documented in real time through radio intercepts and captured documents. By early 1945, communications between Tokyo and field commanders showed a shift from tactical discussions to increasingly desperate ideological exhortations, and orders no longer focused on military objectives but on spiritual endurance. You must show American forces that Japanese spirit cannot be measured by material factors. Sacrifice is victory when it demonstrates the purity of Japanese determination. Every day of resistance proves the superiority of Japanese culture over American decadence. These were the words of a command structure that had lost faith in military victory and retreated into abstraction. They were fighting now not to win but to perform, to demonstrate, to make a statement that would somehow transcend the material reality of their impending defeat. But statements require an audience, and increasingly, the Japanese soldiers being asked to make these sacrifices were unclear on who was supposed to be watching. American forces were certainly not impressed by suicidal resistance. They had developed flamethrower tactics and bunker-busting techniques that made even the most fanatical defense merely time-consuming rather than genuinely threatening. The Japanese home population was increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities, fed a diet of propaganda that bore no relationship to actual events, and the soldiers themselves were losing the capacity to believe their own mythology. American intelligence analysts studying the intercepted communications noted what they termed narrative collapse. Japanese military communications were still using the language of Bushido and divine mission, but the words had become hollow, ritualistic, drained of genuine conviction. And it was as though the entire military apparatus was reciting a script it no longer believed but couldn't stop performing, because to stop would be to admit that the previous 3 years of sacrifice had been for nothing. The American strategy had worked almost too well. They had set out to demoralize the enemy, and they had succeeded in creating something approaching nihilism, a state where Japanese soldiers fought not because they believed in victory or even honorable sacrifice, but because the alternative was confronting the meaninglessness of their situation. The symbolic culmination came with the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. Here, the Americans implemented their psychological warfare doctrine on the largest scale yet attempted. The preliminary bombardment lasted 7 days, not 3, not 6, but 7, establishing a new benchmark of destructive excess. Over 3,000 kamikaze sorties were launched against the American fleet, achieving some tactical successes, but ultimately failing to prevent the invasion. And for the first time, American forces encountered significant numbers of Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. The treatment of these civilians became another element of psychological warfare. American forces established refugee camps, provided medical care, distributed food, the infamous sea rations again, along with medical supplies that Japanese forces had been unable to provide to their own troops. Photos and film footage of these operations were deliberately distributed, while showing Japanese civilians being treated with a degree of humanitarian consideration that contrasted sharply with Japanese military propaganda about American brutality. The message was targeted at the Japanese home islands, now within range of American aircraft. This is what American occupation looks like. Food, medicine, reconstruction. Not the rape and slaughter you've been promised, but the boring mundanity of bureaucratic administration. Some Japanese commanders on Okinawa attempted to counter this by forcing civilian suicides, creating atrocity footage they hoped would stiffen resistance. But these efforts backfired, creating documentation of Japanese brutality toward their own people that American psychological warfare specialists used extensively in broadcasts aimed at the home islands. And the battle for Okinawa lasted 82 days and cost over 100,000 Japanese lives, military and civilian. American casualties were significant, over 12,000 but the ratio was clear. And more importantly, the battle demonstrated that even on an island where Japanese forces had months to prepare, where they had implemented their most sophisticated defensive tactics, where they had the advantage of terrain and interior lines and proximity to reinforcement, the outcome was never in doubt. The Americans simply had too much. Too many ships, too many planes, too many shells, too much food, too much fuel, too much industrial capacity, too much of everything. And the Japanese had no answer except to die more slowly than they might have otherwise. After Okinawa fell, American planners prepared for the invasion of the home islands. Operation Downfall, as it was codenamed, would be the largest amphibious assault in history, involving millions of troops and projecting casualties that made even hardened generals uncomfortable. But the invasion was never launched, because in August 1945, the United States deployed a weapon that rendered all previous psychological warfare obsolete. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were many things: moral catastrophe, technological marvel, strategic necessity, or war crime depending on perspective. But they were also the logical conclusion of the doctrine that had begun at Kwajalein. If the Americans could let the first wave live, so the second wave would die harder through psychological warfare, they could now demonstrate destructive capacity so absolute that no subsequent waves would need to die at all. Yet the bombings were not accompanied by preliminary bombardment. No fleet appeared offshore. No aircraft darkened the skies for days before. Just a single plane, appearing in morning light, dropping a single bomb. And then the city was gone. Not destroyed in the conventional sense of buildings knocked down and streets broken, but erased, transformed into a landscape of ash and shadows where human beings had been reduced to silhouettes burned into concrete. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, became the ultimate witnesses in the American psychological warfare campaign. Their testimony, their injuries, the documentation of what had happened to them, spread through Japan with the force of revelation. And here was proof that American capacity for destruction had transcended the merely industrial and entered the realm of the godlike. You could not train your spirit to resist this. You could not dig bunkers deep enough or instill sufficient fanaticism in your troops. The Americans had found a way to erase cities as casually as one might erase chalk from a board. The Japanese government surrendered 5 days after the second atomic bomb. The decision was framed in terms of protecting the Japanese people from further suffering, but the underlying reality was simpler. The mythology had failed. The belief that Japanese spiritual superiority could offset American material advantages had been tested and found completely, undeniably false. The Americans had won not through superior warrior culture or more honorable conduct, but through superior industrial capacity, superior technology, and superior economic systems that could mobilize those advantages across thousands of miles of ocean. In the end, the war had been decided not by the men who fought, but by the factories that supplied them, the farms that fed them, the political systems that organized them, and the ideological frameworks that motivated them. And in every one of these dimensions, American democracy, chaotic, inefficient, often corrupt, compromised by racism and inequality, had proven more capable than Japanese militarism with its supposed unity of purpose and spiritual purity. In the years following the war, Historians and military analysts studied the Pacific Campaign extensively, yet trying to understand the factors that had determined its outcome. The conventional explanations focused on industrial capacity, geographic advantages, code-breaking intelligence, and specific tactical innovations. All of these were true, but they missed the deeper psychological dimension. The Americans had won the war, not just by killing more effectively, but by systematically dismantling their enemy's capacity to believe in the purpose of their sacrifice. They had taken an enemy that began the war with fanatical determination and ended it with nihilistic resignation. They had transformed Japanese soldiers from warriors who welcomed death to men who still died, but no longer understood why. This was the meaning of letting the first wave live. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't even strategy in the conventional sense. Thus, it was the recognition that in modern industrial warfare, the mind is as much a battlefield as any island or atoll. That psychological defeat precedes military collapse. That making your enemy understand the futility of resistance is more efficient than killing every resisting soldier individually. The doctrine developed in the Pacific, using controlled demonstrations of overwhelming force, ensuring survivors who would carry testimony back to their comrades, systematically documenting and broadcasting evidence of American abundance, would become standard practice in subsequent conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, each would see variations on the same theme: shock and awe, hearts and minds, psychological operations. Yes, different terminology for the same fundamental insight, that wars are won in the space between what soldiers expect and what they experience. The Japanese soldiers garrisoned on those Pacific islands expected to die gloriously, killing Americans in numbers sufficient to make their conquest too costly to sustain. What they experienced instead was a kind of mechanized annihilation that rendered their individual courage irrelevant, their sacrifices meaningless, their entire cultural framework for understanding honorable death obsolete. And the Americans who planned and executed these campaigns understood something profound: that the most efficient way to kill your enemy is to first kill his reasons for fighting, that a demoralized enemy requires fewer bullets, that survivors who testify to futility are more valuable than corpses who testify to nothing. 70 years later, rusted artillery pieces still sit in the jungles of Pacific islands, slowly being consumed by vegetation. The bunkers remain, concrete walls cracked by roots, filled with rainwater and inhabited by crabs. The beaches where thousands died are tourist destinations now, where families spread towels and children play in surf that once ran red. And in archives in Washington and Tokyo, the documents remain: the operational plans, the casualty lists, the prisoner interrogation transcripts, the diary entries of men who saw their world ending and tried to understand why. Reading through these materials, a pattern emerges that transcends the specific historical moment. As the United States did not win the Pacific War because Americans were braver than Japanese soldiers, the evidence suggests comparable levels of courage. It did not win because American commanders were more brilliant tacticians. Japanese military leadership included officers of exceptional skill. It won because American society, for all its flaws, had built systems, economic, industrial, logistical, political, that could mobilize resources at a scale that Japanese society simply could not match. And more importantly, American doctrine evolved to weaponize that disparity, to make the abundance itself into a form of warfare, to ensure that every Japanese soldier who survived an encounter with American forces carried back the message: you cannot win this, you cannot even make it close. You are fighting a nation that treats war as an industrial process and has more capacity to produce destruction than you have capacity to absorb it. This is what it meant to let the first wave live so the second wave would die harder. Not in the physical sense, though casualties did increase as demoralization set in and Japanese tactical coherence collapsed, but in the psychological sense. Each successive garrison fought with less conviction, less hope. less belief in the purpose of their sacrifice. They died harder, not because American forces killed them more effectively, but because they died knowing their deaths changed nothing, proved nothing, accomplished nothing, except to satisfy the demands of a military doctrine that had already lost the war but could not admit it. In the end, the most devastating weapon was not the atomic bomb, though that certainly accelerated the conclusion. It was the simple, terrible understanding that modern industrial warfare is won by factories, not by warriors. That spirit cannot defeat steel when your enemy can produce steel in quantities that make spirit irrelevant. The chocolate bars and ice cream, the sea rations distributed to prisoners, the casual waste of ammunition and supplies. These were not incidental details, but the substance of victory. They communicated a truth that no amount of bombardment could, that America was fighting this war with a fraction of its capacity, that the machinery grinding Japan to dust was just one production line among many, that defeat was not a question of if, but only of when and how many would die first. And the Japanese soldiers who saw this, who survived the bombardments and were captured and fed and shown the supply dumps and the fleet and the photographs of American cities untouched by war, these men carried back a message more devastating than any battlefield defeat, that they were not losing to a more honorable enemy or even a more ruthless one, but to a more productive one. That the war had been decided before the first shot was fired, determined by the same factors that determined which nation could produce more cars, grow more food, generate more electricity. In the ash and rubble of the Pacific Islands, among the rusted weapons and collapsed bunkers, this truth took root. That ideology and honor and willingness to die are not sufficient when your enemy has more of everything and the organizational capacity to deliver it to the battlefield continuously, overwhelmingly, or inevitably. The first wave lived to tell this story. The second wave died knowing it was true. And in that knowledge was the real victory, not over soldiers, but over the ideas that had sent them to die in the first place. Ideas about racial superiority, spiritual supremacy, the decisive importance of will and courage. All these ideas died in the face of American abundance, American logistics, American industrial democracy producing destruction at a rate that made resistance not heroic, but simply futile. This was the doctrine. This was the strategy. This was why the United States let some men live. Because dead men tell no tales, but broken men tell the only tale that matters, that the war is over, even when the fighting continues. And in the years that followed, in the reconstruction of Japan under American occupation, and in the transformation of a militarist empire into a pacifist democracy, in the prosperity that followed defeat, in all of this, the lesson endured. Not that war doesn't pay, but that some nations have so much that they can afford to wage war as a form of demonstration, a proof of concept, a message sent not just to enemies, but to the world, that abundance is power, that logistics is strategy, that the nation which can feed its soldiers ice cream in the tropics while fighting a global war has already won, regardless of what happens on any particular battlefield. The rest is just the working out of implications. The rest is just counting the dead and naming the islands and carving the dates into stone. The rest is just history, and written by survivors trying to explain to those who weren't there what it meant to see the end of the world arrive, not with poetry, but with industrial efficiency. Not with honor, but with overwhelming, undeniable, inexhaustible material superiority. This is what the first wave lived to see. This is what the second wave died understanding. And this is what we inherit. The knowledge that wars are won not by those willing to die, but by those capable of producing more than their enemies can destroy, feeding more soldiers than their enemies can kill, building more ships and planes and bombs than their enemies can sink or shoot down or explode. The Americans let them live not out of mercy, but because living witnesses are more valuable than dead heroes, because the story of defeat must be told, and because in war, as in all things, yet it is not the righteous who prevail, but the productive. The lesson was written in chocolate bars and sea rations, in bombardments that continued after the enemy was broken, in ice cream served on aircraft carriers while men starved on islands 50 miles away. The lesson was, this is what democracy produces, not perfection, not justice, but abundance on a scale that makes resistance futile and sacrifice meaningless. And the men who learned this lesson, who carried it back to their comrades and their commanders and eventually to their children and grandchildren, it ensured that the war would be remembered not for its battles, but for its ultimate truth. That the nation which can afford to let some enemies live, because it has so much capacity to destroy that a few survivors make no difference, has already won a victory more complete than any possible battlefield triumph. This was the doctrine. This is the inheritance. And the rusting guns in the jungle testify to its truth, silent now, but speaking still to those who know how to listen.